Welcome to Peoples and Things, a podcast about human life with technology. I'm your host, Lee Vinsel, an associate professor of science, technology, and society at Virginia Tech. You can reach me with comments and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or on Twitter at STS_news. I would love to hear from you. Wow. Hold on. What was that? Was that an advertisement that played before the Peoples and Things intro? That's never happened before. What gives? Hey everybody, welcome to Peoples and Things. We're very excited to say that we have just joined the New Books Network, which is the largest network of academic podcasts in the world. The NBN currently has over 17,000 interviews with scholars, experts, and authors, gets over 2 million downloads per month, and is in the top 1% of all podcast networks in the world. You should check it out. The New Books Network supports itself through advertising, so you'll be hearing some of that in our episodes going forward. But honestly, I always thought ads would be coming if we were going to keep this show afloat. We'll be dropping a bonus episode sometime this week or next, explaining the partnership and also letting you know about some of our plans for the next year. And now back to our regularly scheduled programming. I think the topic of race and technology is extremely important, not only for understanding our own time, but for understanding modern history in general. This is true both within the United States and in the world abroad. For far too long, there has been far too little work on race and technology, though mercifully, this appears to be changing pretty quickly. Hallelujah. Additionally, and this is sad to say, a lot of stuff written on race and technology recently is pretty thin and not great, especially on the empirical front. Like, if the heart of your argument hinges on Google image searches, you may have just served us weak tea. But again, thankfully and mercifully, there is solid work out there and more is being published every year. If you stick around, you'll be hearing interviews on more of these books on this show. You may know that I am currently working on a new book project called A Good History of Shit Jobs, which examines the changing nature of work in the United States from the 1970s to the present. One of the themes I'm very interested in this project is how deindustrialization and other economic changes affected Black workers, especially urban Black workers. You could say that looking into this topic brought me back home because even the most cursory research turned up the book featured in this episode, Workers on Arrival, Black Labor in the Making of America by historian Joe William Trotter Jr. It was bringing me back home because Joe is the Giant Eagle University professor of history and founder and director of the Center for Africanamerican Urban Studies and the Economy, otherwise known as CAUSE, at Carnegie Mellon University, where I did my doctoral work. My interests at that time were pretty far afield from Joe's, but I have always respected his work. Indeed, his first book, Black Milwaukee, The Making of an Industrial Proletariat, 1915 to 1945, has in the years since I graduated become a very important work for me. Not only because it is simply a good book, but because its appendices include a historiographical essay where Joe lays out how historians and other scholars have thought about his topic since the late 19th century. I believe that essay is a masterpiece, and I use it as an exemplar to teach graduate students how to do such writing. Workers on Arrival is the history of urban Black workers since enslaved Black people arrived on these shores, and it comes right up to the present. Now, Joe doesn't emphasize technology as a theme in the book, but if you approach it with the eyes of a historian of technology on, it's easy enough to see. This long history is a story of black workers laboring in farm fields, establishing themselves as craftspeople, maintaining cities, migrating to urban centers, especially northern ones, becoming industrial hands, fighting for rights and the dignity of work, and facing and resisting the costs of deindustrialization and the rise of the service economy. This is a story that goes way back, but it's also the story of today. It's our story. I had a wonderful time talking to Joe, who I have an enormous amount of respect for. I bet you're going to have a wonderful time listening to him. Hey, get excited. Joe, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Lee.
So Workers on Arrival is a great book. I'm going to be using it in my undergraduate and graduate teaching for years to come, and I've also found it very useful for my own research. So when you explain to people what it's about, what do you say, and what were you trying to do with it?
You know, that's a good lead-off question. What I'm trying to do is very much situated within the moment. Just before 2019, as you know, was the 400th anniversary of African Americans who, on the record, first landed in Jamestown. So that the book itself is a product of many years of research. Over my entire career, I've been working on these issues. And so I started in earnest to produce this book probably about 5 years before 2019 hit. And I worked feverishly because I wanted to complete this book in time for that anniversary. I knew there would be a lot of public celebrations, commemorations of that 400th anniversary of African American life in the United States. And I wanted to have something on record that would synthesize the Black experience from the beginning of the African American experience to the present. And so what I wanted to do, though, was to take it in a somewhat different direction than many other syntheses of Black history take. And that is, I decided to privilege the urban dimension of the Black experience and the urban and working class dimension of the African American experience. And for me, scholars had only just begun, like late 20th, early 20th century, to start in earnest treating African American life from the colonial period forward as also an urban story, not just a rural plantation story of rice, tobacco, and so on, and cotton. It was a story also about the ways in which early Africans inhabited these cities and in many ways helped to construct the urban infrastructure in America. And so that book was designed to address that anniversary issue, but it was also designed to introduce African American labor history more forthrightly at the center of the story, and to also put the Black urban experience up front. And so that was sort of the basis of that particular book.
Well, I think you did a wonderful job, man. And were there certain kind of popular narratives that you were trying to challenge? I was thinking about, the first paragraph of the introduction or preface, I can't remember, and it was, saying like the whole image in American culture, sadly, of kind of like Black people as takers and and the white working class is like, somehow put upon and all these kinds of things. I mean, were there a number of popular narratives you're trying to challenge?
Well, thank you for bringing that one up. That's another dimension of this story. This is not just about Black workers, but also their relationship to white workers and to American society more generally. But also it's a story about the Black workers' relationship to their own community. especially the emerging elite and people who were educated and property. But yes, I was very concerned about a race. There was a race agenda, like how has white workers perceived, and American society in general, perceived black, poor, and working class people over a long period of time. And I'm just struck by the consistency of treating these people as pretty much, like you said, takers rather than producers. And that these people in some ways lack a good work ethic, that they are not energetic, they are not builders. And so I wanted to bring this whole question of productivity of black workers and their contribution to building American society. And not only just building the urban infrastructure. And if the story had been about agriculture, it would have been about black people building the agricultural infrastructure. Because when you think about agriculture, cotton, tobacco, rice, sugar, all of those, the land had to be prepared for the cultivation of these crops. And so that black people were on board to actually carve out, the landscape and to create an agricultural and agrarian setting in which black people would then labor within that setting to produce these staple crops. And so black people were laborers from the beginning in both the rural and the urban environment. And inside the cities, of course, they were also builders. They were laborers on these construction projects. And they were also maintenance workers. Once the cities got started, they continued to work to maintain and upkeep and to clean and to do all those other things that cities required. So there was a story about trying to recover, in a way, the vibrancy of black workers as producers and contributors to the society in which they were forced initially to live and later on as free people of color.
Yeah. Joe, one of the things I like to do on this podcast is kind of turn scholarship into a human story, that it's done by human beings and, who have their own personal trajectories. So let's just start. Where do you grow up, man?
Southern West Virginia.
Oh.
I'm a product of a coal mining family.
Okay.
My father was a coal miner.
Wow.
And he worked in the coal mines for over 20 some years before his death.
Wow.
And so I come from a large family. My family, there were 14 children in my family, four boys and 10 girls.
That's a lot of sisters, man.
A lot of sisters, and I get the benefit of that. It's been a great ride for me. Because I had 5 sisters older than me and 5 sisters younger than me. And so in a way, I had to develop a kind of sensitivity to the power of women because, a young boy can't go challenging, sisters who were some, 3, 4, 5, 6 years older. So they could check that masculinity,
Well, that's good for us.
So yes, I really, but growing up in West Virginia, by the way, just back in November, earlier this month, my nephews and my 3 brothers, we got together to take them down to the coal mining area that we grew up in. Their uncles grew up in. And we actually visited and toured a demonstration mine. And there were about 15 of us. And we had a great tour, about 2 hours inside a coal mine that has been refurbished and made safe as mines can be for tourists to take. And so that heritage is important to me. And it really helped to shape the kind of historian I became and the kind of issues I would examine.
Yeah, that's great, man. And you have a book on coal, right? That's your one book I haven't looked at, right? Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Coal, Class, and Color.
Cool.
That was my second book, by the way. And I think that you know, I didn't want to do, that close-up story first. And I had become much more involved in trying to understand the urban.
Right.
So that when I went to graduate school,
yeah,
the cities were on my mind.
Yeah, please. I was going to ask you how you became a professional historian. So tell us that story.
Oh yeah, when I went to graduate, yeah. Well, you're asking questions that I'm happy to talk about. When I went to graduate school, and I went to graduate school in the mid '70s, and I had taught high school for 6 years. My wife and I, we taught high school together. Although she was at a junior high, I was in a high school. And after 6 years, we decided that if we were ever going to graduate school, we probably needed to go then. And she was really persuasive on that, and I got on board with it. And I wanted to go to graduate school, but I also liked making a living. And we knew we would have to give up our teaching job in order to, scale back and just, concentrate on studying. So when I went to graduate school, I went with the ideal that I wanted to do an urban study. And so I had, both of us, we went to a small Lutheran school called Carthage College in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And it's a Lutheran school. And Carthage, by the way, was originally located in Carthage, Illinois. But the city of Kenosha gave them an incentive to actually move the campus from Carthage, Illinois, out to a beautiful lakeside campus in Kenosha, Wisconsin. So that's where we went to school. And that's where I met a lot of my friends who lived in the Milwaukee area. Also, many of them lived in Chicago. But I wasn't about to do Chicago, considering the wealth of documentation
of Black
life in Chicago. Yeah, I just said we need some alternative study.
Exactly.
So I selected Milwaukee, and I stayed with it. I never considered doing Chicago. But the irony is that much of Chicago's migration fed into the Milwaukee migration. So people often had a stopover in Chicago or some other small industrial town. Then they moved to Milwaukee. And so, so when I got to graduate school, cities were on my mind. I hadn't given very much thought at all to the idea that there was a study waiting to be done in the area where I grew up.
And, I was going to ask you about Black Milwaukee, which is a really important book to me. As I've told you, I'll talk more about the interpretive essay at the end of it in a second, but I use it in my teaching with grad students a lot. And, I wanted to bring it up because I think it's, it's very, Workers on Arrival is just, another part of this long trajectory that you've been working on. Yeah, and so, tell people a bit about Black Milwaukee. Is it fair to say it's about this transition from rural, it's about the Great Migration in many ways, and it's about this transition from rural agricultural work to urban industrial work, right?
Exactly. And again, that's my foundational book. I mean, it is where I had the opportunity to think deeply about the Black urban experience.
Yeah.
When I went to graduate school, by the way, I was coming from Kenosha, Wisconsin. My wife and I, we were both active in community organizing in Kenosha. And at that time, the Black Power movement was in full swing. And by the mid-'70s, however, like this whole idea of race first and the way Black people conceptualize their future, and their politics. And so there's a great emphasis on racial unity, solidarity among people of color. And so, but by the time, by the mid-'70s, a lot of critics had started to raise the class question. And to really, they started to question this idea of overwhelming emphasis on the racial dynamic in Black life. And they started to say, until we get a handle on these class dimensions of African American life, we're going to have an incomplete understanding of Black history and also an incomplete understanding of American history. and so that's what sort of drove
That's
my
interesting.
study of Milwaukee.
Huh.
Yeah, and so I had to really find a way to break out. No, not totally break with it, but to really, complicate
Yes.
my racial understanding of the Black experience by bringing in the way in which African American, for example, the scholarship that dominated the literature when I studied in graduate school. And by the way, I went to graduate studies at Minnesota, and there was a man named Alan Spear on the faculty. Alan Spear in 1967 had produced this stellar community study of Chicago. And it was like the making of a ghetto in Chicago. And I read that book, like religiously read that book. And I also read a lot of other urban stuff, but that was a real model when I hit graduate studies. I had just done a summer graduate course because as high school teachers, you had to periodically go back to school and you would have to take some courses. And in this case, I took a course in urban history and I wrote a paper on Black urban life. Had I not written that paper, I'm not sure I would have found my way into anybody's graduate school because I didn't have a great writing sample to give before I wrote that paper. And at that point, I was accepted into the program at Minnesota. And so in other words, the ghetto dominated scholarship, and it was a process. And I was taken by the way it helped us understand a lot about Black life. But then as we talked more about class and tried to figure out ways to incorporate a class dimension, it became clear that the ghetto model was limited and that it didn't go far enough toward illuminating some other. And so that's why, in a way, I sort of flipped, the coin in a way over and centered the dynamic of what I call proletarianization. I put that at the center of my analysis. And then I didn't deny that the ghetto was important, but I actually argued that you can understand the ghetto better by looking at proletarianization.
Yeah, exactly.
So that was my argument.
Well, Joe, I mean, this kind of like the way you just explained that of like really getting into the literature on the ghetto, but then seeing its limits and going beyond it and coming up with a new framework that incorporates what came before and doesn't just overthrow it or throw it away. I mean, like, dude, that's your spirit in a way. Like when I read, like when I teach, so I teach an appendix in Black Milwaukee, which is a historiographical essay on Black urban life that you wrote. And I think it's just one of the great historiographical essays ever written. And I used to teach it like students how to do it. But then I was reading Workers on Arrival. And initially I didn't notice the essay on sources at the end. I was just focusing on the book. I didn't listen to Scott Sandage and read the table of contents closely enough. So a couple of days ago, I started reading that essay on sources and Workers on Arrival, and you did it again. I mean, and so, and so, like, I was going to add, because I think it's so important as a teaching thing, like, your spirit, you really read people deeply, and you really try to understand the history and historiography of the literature on your topic, but then you're not uncritical, like, you're critical, but you're generous, And so,
well, thank you.
Yeah, so I just wonder, like, how would you learn how to do that, man? Like,
that's a good question. I think graduate school was a major place for me to begin thinking about ways to grapple with large amounts of scholarship that you may not be able to really deal with in any great depth, but you really needed to understand at least the sort of the core, contribution. And also, I just believe strongly that we don't ever just invent the wheel. We're building on other people's work all the time. And it really helps to enrich our understanding when we can show that for a moment, we can just say, okay, let's try to understand this book from the vantage point of the author's real intent. What are they trying to do? And try to give them a stage in your work where you can acknowledge, okay, here, this book really doesn't say everything I wanted to say, but it says something important. So I'm going to try to give them some credit there. And it makes synthesis, I think, for me, a little bit more manageable and also more defensible, because people work hard to produce their work. And even if you find other sources that can say this, what you wanted to say, it makes sense to, I think, to acknowledge that there are some other people working in this vineyard. And the more we can acknowledge that, the better we are. And it creates community. You know, people part of a network of scholars who build on each other, who appreciate and reinforce. So that's sort of my way of wanting to deal with that kind of thing. And I know it's limited. You know, nobody can really grasp all that's important in the field. And I always understand that when I look at the literature, I'm doing a piece of it in a way from my vantage point. But hopefully it is helpful. It
is helpful, man. Yeah. And I want to ask you one more question before we kind of jump into talking about workers in arrival in detail. And do you consider yourself a labor historian? Is that part of your identity?
You know, I came to labor slow freight in a way, because as I said, my orientation and my foundation was grounded in a highly race-conscious analysis of the African-American experience. So I consider myself an African-American.
Okay, yeah.
Right? And so that means that I take race seriously, and I try to see how Black people across all kinds of internal divides, whether it's gender, class, age, generational, Black people share something around that whole process of racialization that is taking place in America. So I try to claim, you know, I am an African American, but within that framework, I'm an urbanist. You know, I claim the urban myself as an urban historian in a real way. That's sort of the setting in which most of my actual analysis takes place, inside the urban context. And then on the other end of this, because I'm trying to develop a more class-conscious study of the Black experience, I do claim, and I do that from the vantage point of labor and working class people. So I do claim labor as one of the areas that I am, you know, committed to, rather than claiming that I'm a historian of the Black middle class. You know, I talk about the Black middle class a lot, but I don't claim myself to be a historian of the Black middle class. And the way, so it's African American urban and labor history. That's the sort of
working class history.
Okay.
So jumping into workers on arrival, I mean, we should know that Black people were brought to these shores, as you said earlier, as slaves who, lives were focused on agricultural production. But by the late 1700s, already there are populations of free Blacks working in American cities. So tell us a bit about the genesis of the Black working class and, how it emerged and what its early characteristics were.
Yes. Okay. Well, one of the things I try to do in the book is to acknowledge that the Black urban working class and the enslavement of Black people unfolded almost simultaneously in the North and the South. And so some of the earliest residents in New York, Boston, Philadelphia,
Williamsburg, all these places, right?
Right. And then we got Charleston, New Orleans, Richmond, Baltimore, and so on. So I see that I try to make the point that in many ways, Black people entered the kind of urban port places, places that were ports, cities, even before they started to ship out, to the plantation, and so that we need to really treat these environments in sync because they are unfolding almost simultaneously. And so that, but I do make the point that the colonial period, for lack of of a better term and way of framing it, I do treat the entire period before the Civil War pretty much as the pre-industrial age.
Sure.
In African, in African American life. So that it was a predominantly agrarian age, because most black people were, in fact, cultivating sugar, cultivating tobacco, rice, and cotton later. And I try to make the point that cotton is a later product, because I think the popular community often think cotton was, an enduring, almost unchanging, that was the crop. They don't realize that it was a process of different crops, and that cotton came later. But once it came, it overwhelmed, the economy. It became the driver, of the capitalist development of the nation, in many ways, the world, global capitalism. So I try to make that point, and that black people were at the center, at the labor center of this. And, there's a lot of literature, as you know now, Johnson, Beckert, Baptist, all of those guys, they have really fleshed out the whole capitalist relationship to slavery and race. And so we got a good body of literature to build that economic, scaffolding. But I try to really go directly to the experiences of blacks in these economies. And so I'm very attentive, I think, to the workplace. And so that in the Workers on Arrival, I really built upon, the sort of, actually, I don't do too much of the agriculture and Workers on Arrival.
Yeah, well, you don't have to, right? It's not your focus.
But I acknowledge that. And so, but then moving into the cities, I try to make a point that black people were not just general laborers in the cities, unskilled, whatever, however we want to put it. They were craftsmen and women. And that was an important component of the pre-industrial workforce, that black people were part of an artisan class. And in some ways, I argue that the period from about the end of the American Revolution to the first decade or two of the 19th century, that some people have suggested that was a golden age of the black artisan. Because so there was a significant body of people who were carpenters, blacksmiths, coopers, all of those crafts. But by the late antebellum period, these black craftsmen were on the down.
Yeah, dude, it was fascinating for me. I love that early craft, early Republic stuff. I'm kind of nerdy about that stuff. Well, I didn't know this story. And then you kind of, one of the stories you tell is that, one of the reasons it's on a downturn is because it's kind of being attacked from all these different sides. There's mob violence. There's European immigration. There's all these efforts to so-called repatriate, free blacks to Africa and other places. And as you put it, early African-American workers and their families would not take these limits on their freedom without a fight. So tell us a bit about how they resisted and tried to make a space for themselves.
Yeah, that's good. Lee, I'm really just very appreciative of the way you have really zeroed in on some of the things that I was hoping people would take away from the book. But there is this, it's almost like the old story, we would say that there are victimization histories of black people. And for many, decades, we understood we had to write that history because there was so much denial of the way in which black people were exploited, denied rights, and, sort of trampled on. And so we needed to write that history. But I do give a lot of attention to the idea that, look, these people were not just, victims of these conditions under which they lived and worked. They were also thoughtful people who envisioned different ways that they could affect changes in their lives, both their work lives, the lives of their families, their community. And so all along the way, whatever the work regimen may have been, and however unjust that regimen may have been, I tried to talk about ways that Black people intervene into that system, and they help to modify some of the impact. And you know, one of the things drawn directly from labor history more generally is this whole idea of transiency. You know, leaving a job. You know, quitting. And then in the case of the enslaved, fugitive. I mean, fugitive just, you know, and so the fugitives in a way dovetail with the behavior of free workers. It's only that they are stealing away, right? Their own time, their own bodies. And then free workers are sort of saying, oh, I'm not going to.
I'm out of here, man.
You know, they, right, exactly. That's it. And you hear a lot of that today, right? So that was one strategy, you know, and I like to make that. Because you see, that strategy created a lot of misinterpretation of the Black workers' experience. They were called unstable. They were not dependable because look at them. They're moving all the time from one job to the next. They don't stay in the place. They're not, you know, they're not stable. Right. They're not reliable. They're not dependable. Right. And so we had to reshape that narrative into one in which, wait a minute, did you talk to these people about why they're leaving? Yeah. And when you do investigate the underlying causes for leaving, you begin to see a different interpretive frame for understanding. So so that's one strategy. Yeah. But the other one, there are a lot of others, but I put a lot of emphasis on their, you know, building families. Also, you know, they work hard to build families and to really create opportunities to really, you know, connect, you know, with their kin. You know, so that in a way was a strategy, but the community building beyond that was especially vibrant. They tried to build, initially they were informal networks, you know, with different people would connect with each other without any formal apparatus, but they knew that they could depend on each other in different ways. But then they started to build these organizations. And so churches, fraternal orders, small businesses, all those things start to come to the fore. And so I like to, at one level, reinterpret Black entrepreneurship as a labor strategy, as well as a strategy toward trying to become middle class. You know, so that if you're really a worker who, you know, you feel like you've got skills, but those skills are not recognized, then you feel like maybe I could market my own skills. You know, I can go into the marketplace. Maybe I can even hire some other African Americans, and we can really liberate ourselves from these ways. You know, some of so there are a variety of tactics that I like to explore and to bring to the forefront.
Well, it's fascinating. You write about how following the Civil War and emancipation, Black people initially, you know, often idealized a land ownership and agricultural life, but these dreams were undermined by a number of factors, including white power and eventually the rise of Jim Crow and all these kinds of things that are kind of familiar. So how did emancipation kind of set the stage for the rise of the Black urban industrial class that you've been studying for so long?
Okay. Excellent question. This period is pivotal moment in African American history because for the first time, at least in legal terms, African Americans are free. They are entitled to the same rights, privileges, immunities, you know, as all other citizens. But the truth is, they don't get equal access to those rights. But it's important. I don't argue that emancipation was of no consequence. Even during those early years where we began to see the so-called Black codes and all of the violence and all of the suppression of freedom of the emancipated people. I just can't make the argument that it was slavery by another name. You know, just there was something different about freedom. And so I try to make the point that it was real. Blacks had more options, but those options were stymied time and time again by some practices by almost everybody played a role in undercutting. You know, the state was a partner in suppressing the free engagement of blacks in the economy. Of course, former landowners, ex-Confederates, they were very much involved in undercutting the capacity of black people to be free. And even the philanthropists or the reformers or the people who came from the north to the south to sort of set up these schools and missionary society, they also reinforced a kind of coerced status for blacks. And the major way they did that is that they were so riveted to this ideal that black people had to be made to work for wages. And that if they were not forced to work for wages, they would not work. So that was a real racial stereotype operating among the most liberal of black allies, and that there was a sense that they needed some form of coercion to do the work. And so some of these Freedmen's Bureau policies and so on, they came close to denying people food and shelter in order to force them into the workforce with their former, owners. And so, and also with the northern capitalists moving south, they saw this emancipated black labor as a real boon to their own riches. And so you begin to see them opening up timberland, opening up coal fields, setting up cotton mills. And so Northerners were very much, it was a collaboration. Northern and Southern capitalists, they collaborated on the exploitation of black labor. And so the emancipation period really undercut, the freedoms and the labor experiences of blacks during that period.
So, the Great Migration in many ways, I think, is a fairly well-known story in U.S. history. I mean, there's been PBS specials and best-selling books on it. And it's important. It gives us, among other things, like cultural things like electric blues and, urban jazz. I'm a big John Lee Hooker fan and Chess Records fan and all that stuff, And Motown and all this kind of stuff, these beautiful expressions of African-American urban culture. But, I wonder I wanted to ask you, what do you think is missing from kind of like standard accounts of the Great Migration that maybe we need to complicate this story a little bit?
I've seen the Great Migration undergo a profound change, so at this point, there are just a few areas that I could point to. Because, for a long time, we just didn't treat the Great Migration as a process that blacks themselves helped to shape. It was always something that was done to blacks. Even when they moved out of the South, they were not moving on their own volition. They were being, pushed out, or pulled into the North. That even settling in northern industrial areas was not part of their. It was part of the recruiters in northern industry going down and pulling them north. And they just didn't have very much agency in that process at all. And so that's no longer a story, that we have to correct. That story has been told. And by telling that story of black agency in the Great Migration, it just opens the door for us to see more vibrant parts of that. And I think the music and the art that you were talking about, that was a blind spot, that people weren't treating it as much as a powerful way in which black people were speaking and shaping, the black urban experience. So, there's not a lot that I would be able to turn to for you to think about the next wave of migration studies, except there is one. Recently, like that moment I was telling you, the 400th year anniversary of the African American experience in America, you can see that sort of shaping. That's a different moment in Black history and some other things happening. Like at that point, that's Obama. We've had the first
I watched his swearing in with you in the seminar room at Carnegie Mellon.
Oh, yeah.
It's a fond memory of mine. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting because that was a major milestone. And so I had to think about, and see, that was such a great milestone that it forced us to see the contradictions in more stark terms than we had previously. Because most of us historians, we were convinced that we would have to wait another half a century or a century before that happened. And so we got caught off guard. Black historians, we got caught off guard. We didn't know how to quite even respond.
I think you said that at the time, so at least you were self-aware.
That was something. But Lee, over the last 5 years, let's say over the last 3 years, Trump was elected in 2016, right? So we can just say over the last 5 years or so. And even over the last year, the landscape keeps changing, right? We keep getting these signals that are very mixed, and they're I'll just say contradictory. For example, the midterm election 2022 in Black history term, produced some amazing performances on the part of Blacks. Even when they lost the election, they were making, making a bid and a serious bid and making serious inroads on the electorate, right? And so you have that happening. And then in the same year, I think within roughly the same year, you have Buffalo, mass killing in Buffalo in a supermarket. And then you get Ketanji Brown Jackson becoming the first female
Supreme Court
justice. And then not to mention Vice President, of the United Kamala Harris. And so you try to. And so now this is the moment. And then we got the attack on the nation's capital and the threats to American democracy. And now we have to, as Black labor and urban historians, we've got to write. And then we got the pandemic, right? We got the pandemic. So we're situated in this moment. And so to answer your question, the pandemic is the one I wanted to point to. I think the next wave of migration research, urban research, got to take care of that health issue. Got to connect African Americans to past pandemics, past epidemics, past disease.
I hear you.
Past, in the medical. So I think that is another frontier to be crossed. And because many of these African Americans, for example, if you say, what made Black people migrate? We're good at economics. We're good at education. We have not said that Black people move to get better health care.
Yeah, totally right.
Yeah. And frankly, Lee, in my own family, I have a brother who just wrote a memoir on his life, but he incorporated the Trotter family, and it's a memoir on medical experience.
Interesting.
Because he was born with congenital heart disease. And he had multiple heart operations across his lifetime. He's still living and, doing pretty well, but struggling still, but he wrote this book. And one of the things that stand out in that book to me is how our mother, after our father passed away, one reason we moved from coal camps to small town in Ohio is so he could be closer to medical treatment. That there was no way he was going to get heart surgery in the coal town. So that's an area that I think is wide open.
Yeah, that's cool.
For this next wave. And there's a lot of technology stuff
Oh, absolutely.
right down
Yeah.
your alley in this medical field.
Yeah.
Is just so that's an area. And actually, I wrote an essay for a book called Pandemic Divide. And I wrote an essay in there, and that's where I really go into details about the way African American work exposed them to all these diverse diseases and opened the way ultimately for something like, COVID to hit with a vengeance on that particular population.
That's great. I'll send you. I'll try to remember to send you. There's this. There's an collect. What do they call it? Special issue where a bunch of historians wrote about Thomas Piketty's new book, Capital and Ideology, and one of the best essays in there is about inequality in health. And by a historian, Johann Matthew, who I think is at Princeton or Rutgers maybe. And I'll send it to you because I think it connects deeply to what you're talking about. We need to get more into the kind of embodied history of health history and how it played a role in all this stuff.
Yeah, I would like that. I would appreciate it.
Can you tell us about the racial job ceiling? And one of the reasons, this is kind of when Black people started working in industrial jobs, one of the reasons I'm interested in this question is I see a tension here between you draw out this tension between the opportunities that industry provided Black workers, but also how there was limits that they're constantly bumping up to.
Exactly. Well, Lee, I am just amazed at the way you've delved into these issues. That's a major issue in African American labor and working class history. And see, one reason why it's such a significant and daunting part of the story is because the Great Migration generated a lot of excitement among Black people. I'm talking working class, like grassroots Black people, from the bottom up. Moving to Chicago was a great move for a lot of people. They celebrated that move in no uncertain term. And to Detroit, to New York, all of those cities, as difficult as life may have been, it was hard to squash that optimism about life in those cities. And part of it, no doubt, had to do with the racial environment, having to tiptoe around Southern Jim Crow on a day-to-day basis was different from having to live in Harlem or the south side of Chicago, even though we know that the roots of lethal policing starts early in the Great Migration in those places. But compared to the South, for at least a moment of the Great Migration, those things seemed like, there was a breakthrough, So the job ceiling, and then getting jobs. By the way, let's say the First World War, Black people didn't get a lot of jobs above what we would call the baseline unskilled, so-called unskilled general labor job. They were just getting them inside the factory. But they, for the most part, that first wave did not get a lot of operative jobs, jobs as operative. And so they were more or less doing the same thing inside the factory that they were doing outside the factory. But they were inside the industrial economy, and therefore their proximity and their engagement with the workplace sort of opened up, some channels for them to experience some gradual movement into some of these production jobs. But the meatpacking industry is a great example where they were just cleaning. Did you see that film called The Killing Floor?
I haven't seen it yet, no.
Oh, you with your labor interest, The Killing Floor would be a great film for your undergraduates. Yeah, and it's just been refurbished and put out again. David Brody played a role in advising on that film. And recently they just put it out on DVD again. So you can get if you can get a copy of that. And it shows Black workers in there. And it also shows Black workers and white workers trying to bridge that racial divide and create a union in the meatpacking houses. But yeah, the job ceiling, it in many ways it was a ceiling that was reinforced by both industry and workers, white workers. White workers were very protective of their, their turf on those jobs, and so they created some pretty stiff barriers that black people had to navigate in order to get into those.
And by the way, I mean, this is it connects to our health discussion we just had too, because like I know the automotive story best.
Yeah.
Because that was my research early on, and like black workers were often doing like painting and all these very dirty, very health and detrimental jobs.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. You got it. And in fact, this essay that I wrote about this, that was one of the very hazardous jobs that really undercut the health of black workers. So so that job ceiling, I would just say that it was a pretty stiff, and also the skilled trade unions, the skilled crafts unions, they had explicit barriers on black people entering these trades. So, going into a factory and having to become an operative was a step down for many white workers. But once they had to do that work, they weren't about to relinquish it for black people to easily come in and become machine, operators.
So let's carry. I mean, one of the things it's really starting to come out to me in our discussion of your book is this kind of dialectic where you move into a historical moment in the book, and then the dialectic is, instead of allowing the victimization narrative to reign in every historical moment, you turn to what black people were doing, through their own efforts. So, with the racial job ceiling, you write African American workers deplored their tenuous hold on urban industrial jobs, homes, social services, and justice before the law during the years of the Great Migration. And you say, some considered her heading back south, but most stayed and worked to strengthen their hold position in society. So what are some of the ways they reacted, and tried to do that?
Yeah, well, again, leaving jobs on a regular basis, that turnover rate was enormous. The other way is that they started to organize their own, labor unions to try to get some traction in jobs. But the ironic part is the most famous of these labor unions by the 1920s was the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in the railroads. And those jobs were essentially domestic jobs, right? Cleaning train cars. But there were some black railroad unions and some what you might call carpenters unions, some brick mason unions, all black unions. That was another strategy that they used to try to compete in the labor force and to create more opportunities for themselves. And during this period, one of the things I'm beginning to look at more now is that some of them actually started construction companies.
Oh, fascinating.
That they would try to employ their own people, get contracts to build black churches, repair black churches, other institutions to really help themselves. And also, of course, they joined the NAACP and started to level legal struggles against some of these barriers that they knew were unjust and that should have been challenged, legally and in the courts. So the strategies are numerous. But the way I argue for the interwar years is that ultimately there was a convergence of middle and working class black activism, so that racial barriers were so strong that limited black access to education, to training, especially hospitals and nursing, schools, that there was a way in which black communities converged and created a sense of solidarity in building some of these separate, and what I call the creation of the black metropolis. They started to build their own city within the city to try and service their own needs within that, including employment needs. And in fact, one of the great arguments for black business was that it becomes a vehicle for employing black people. So black business people were pushing that line, and then black working people were also, of course, pushing to get alternative employment. So and so there's a lot going on, a lot of strategies cross-cutting, some of them in tension, because there are times when the strategies were in opposition, to each other.
Yeah, and I mean, I should just say, like, there's so much in the book that we can't cover in an interview, but one of the things that I really like about the book is that you do go over through so many strategies. So I think I would just direct readers, that's one great reason to read the book.
Okay.
So one of the things, I think that this is well known in your historical circles, but I was thinking about, how in popular culture we tend to focus on the story of the civil rights movement on segregation and like buses and lunch counters and all these things, and for good reason, right? I mean, there's those are important stories, but what your book really draws out so centrally is the labor and work aspect of the what you call the modern Black freedom struggle. So, but you write by 1970, the modern Black freedom struggle had demolished the Jim Crow order, and I think we know in general outlines that story. But how did it open up new opportunities for Black people when it came to employment?
Yeah. That is a brief moment. It really is a very brief moment. But when you look at the statistics on Black population movement into skilled jobs and into jobs that are defined as middle class, the numbers increase significantly. I don't have the figures in my head right now, but and also the numbers increase significantly from the bottom up. Like it's not just that
there's mobility,
only middle class. Yeah, there was great mobility out of the Black working class into what would be considered a professional and, sort of business class jobs. So, but it's a brief moment, Lee, and it's one of the most difficult transitions to try to really navigate and articulate in a book. But I tried to make it clear that the civil rights movement was a success in significant ways, and that we can't dismiss.
Just like you were saying about slavery earlier, there's something real changes.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, that's right. And that's what I argue for this. Yeah. You're right. That's exactly, it's an argument that could, but then pretty quickly, and also the laws, you start getting court decisions that support affirmative action, support more vigorous movements to eliminate the color line, that call labor unions to task for their discriminatory policy, call businesses to task. So there's a moment there where the state seems to be a real ally for Black people, federal state in particular. And so I like to make that point. But that moment of opportunity closed pretty quickly. And it's a devastating closing because African Americans, just as they're making that breakthrough, that whole
dude, that's where I want to go next. I mean, reading your book, I experienced like this acute irony that I think I knew about, and even I would say even knew very well on a purely intellectual level. But then it just hit me on this emotional level, like a gut punch, And the irony is that, you write that by 1970, the modern Black freedom, I already quoted this, modern Black freedom struggle had demolished the Jim Crow order. Well, then we're into the 1970s when the U.S. economy hits the skids. By the late 1970s, we have a fresh wave of deindustrialization and plat cultures. So the modern Black freedom struggle undermines, it doesn't completely destroy, but it undermines a terrible system of oppression. But then it's right into real economic hardship, right?
Exactly. And that's part of the African American story historically, the way you make certain strides forward and then you hit this brick wall, you face another crisis of survival. And see, right now, Lee, I think that what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to revamp this narrative a little bit. I wrote this book, finished this book in around 2018, right? I think now in the context of knowing more about how the post-industrial period is unfolding, in my book, let's just say, I tended to focus on deindustrialization and the downside of that process for Black workers. They start to enter the service industry, low wage, few benefits, very, very difficult jobs, to navigate. And they suffer. That's sort of the story right there. And they suffer.
No, without that, as you point out, they're reacting. They have agency. They're doing things. You draw on the literature to tell that story. Yeah.
Yeah. But here's the other thing. Recently, I'm working on something with another scholar, 3 scholars, in fact, is another book on an edited collection of essays on the Black urban experience. And one of the arguments that our essay makes, and you know Clarence Lang?
No, I don't.
Clarence Lang is an African-American historian who wrote a book on St. Louis. And Clarence has brought to our attention a body of work on Latino history, like late 20th, early 21st century, where scholars are beginning to look at this deindustrialization from the vantage point of how African Americans, Latino workers at the bottom, they were not only suffering from the downside of the industrial economy, but they were fueling the revival of the new economy. And that's a big difference in argument.
And the new economy means different things in different circles. So what's it mean here?
Yeah. It means the jobs that are fueling the health industry. Yeah. And in Pittsburgh, you got
Gabriel Wynant's book and stuff like that. Yep.
You got it, exactly. And so, and he makes that argument too, that Black people are working. And so, but really that's an argument to be pushed more explicitly, is that that Black people are again helping to fuel the economy. In ways that people don't often
the home healthcare workers are predominantly minority folks, and they're not well paid, and it's a real issue.
Right.
Go ahead, Joe. Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm going to say, but to treat that as a way of fueling the economic vitality of UPMC.
Oh yeah.
As opposed to, as opposed to just forcing Blacks into another era of poverty. Those are two different dynamics around the same issue, right? And so that's why I think, just moving back and forth between these different processes is going to be very important.
I totally agree with you.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so I grew up in Joliet, Illinois. I don't know if I ever talked to you about this. So
I didn't know you were from Joliet, but when I was in Evanston, Illinois as an undergraduate, I learned about the prison.
Yes, the 2 prisons, Joliet and Stateville. That was our economy, man.
Well, that's the only thing I understood about Joliet.
So it was it was a steel town, a very racially diverse place. It was a very urban place. My high school had about 2,000 kids in it, and it was about 1/3 white, 1/3 Black, and 1/3 Latino. Is that right? So this is, there's a lot of poverty by the 90s when I was a teenager. But this is what drives I care about this stuff because, I come from a very particular place and I saw people struggling and, this is kind of drives my whole interest. And I also am working on a research project. It has this kind of funny working title called A Brief History of Shit Jobs, which is like the rise of bad employment since the 70s, basically. So, one of the stories I've really gotten interested in, and I wanted to get your take because it's something you've been thinking about for a long time, is I become interested in debates in the 80s and 90s about kind of urban, Black, ghetto stuff, like William Julius Wilson's When Work Disappears. Eventually you have Thomas Segrew's, The Origins of the Urban Crisis book. And I was actually reading Joe Trotter in this edited volume, The Underclass Debate, Views from History. So there's this whole debate, that deindustrialization has given birth to this new underclass that was the emphasis. So I just wonder, and you deal with it in the interpretive essay, the essay on sources. Yeah. I just wonder, where do you think this kind of story comes down? Where are you at with this story at this point?
about
the
the
urban,
deindustrialization.
yeah, and
Yeah.
the underclass and all these kinds of debates.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that one of the things about the underclass debate that Wilson, in a way,
Right.
initiated, is that initially it did the same thing that some of these other earlier studies did, and that was to ignore the
Yeah.
agency of the very poor people that they were talking about. That was my big beef with some of the earlier. But then Wilson came back with a volume called "When Work Disappears."
Yeah,
You
that's
know
the
that
one I just quoted. Yeah, I love that book. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, the other one was the truly disadvantaged. Yeah, you're right. But then that one gives a little more attention to the experiences of the workers and the poor, and also a more ethnographic, right? A more ethnographic perspective. So my thinking is that we need to do more with the issue from the vantage point of those people who are defined in those terms, and to really flesh that out, and also to not treat them as permanently divorced from the workplace, because they are, informal, under the table work is an ongoing part of their lives, and so almost all of them are working in some form. So to treat them as a segment divorced from the workplace, I think is
totally
problematic.
We have a trouble dealing with transiency, like you said earlier. Just in terms of thinking, we have trouble dealing with it, I think,
Right. Yeah, you're right. Do you know a book on Milwaukee called Evicted?
Yes, I know that book. That's a great book.
Okay, yeah. I think it's relevant to this story that we're talking about. But that one is a great victimization dimension to all that. But there may be some things, I'll have to take another look, but there may be things in there that give you a sense of the agency of these people. But I read that book quickly for a perspective, in this period. And I picked up more of the downside than anything else.
I hear you. Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. I mean, I think it's about how these structures are leading to suffering and harm, right? But we don't, some of the other books you write about in the sources essay really clearly focus on this agency thing and are focusing on how people are reacting and working with the systems they're living in. Yeah.
Yeah.
I had one other question for. Oh, go ahead, Joe.
No. I just wanted to say, So I think my perspective on this is still
evolving,
taking shape. Okay, because we're still in the moment, right? We're not quite out of that deindustrial. This new configuration is still unfolding.
No, I think it's feeding all the Trump and all this other crap very much. Well, I mean, I think. The other question I wanted to ask you about, one of the people I've started focus on as a character in this new book project is actually Obama. But I'm starting with his early days as a community organizer, because the organization he worked on with in Calumet in the South Side was basically focused on deindustrialization and job loss in black communities, right? And so I become really interested in his early work, as a young guy. And so I don't know. I mean, do you have any tips for me on things I should look at?
No, I think you're already on the right track. Because I thought about Obama's election and his work, and I didn't get into it as much as you're going to, but I felt that his candidacy was grounded in the working class, the way the working class were experiencing certain issues and the way they could be mobilized as voters in this new politics, so I'm glad to see you do that.
I mean, I think there's unfortunate parts of him, like by 2006, he gives this, or 2006, he gives this talk, 21st Century Schools for 21st Century Jobs, which is kind of really buys into like education as the answer to all social problems in a way that there's some unfortunate sides of his story too, but I just think he's a fascinating character to kind of trace through the time.
Oh man,
so Yeah.
Well, look, I'm delighted to hear you talk about this project. This I think is very worthwhile, and I think you are very well situated to do that kind of work. So yeah. So, this has just been a delightful conversation with you.
Yeah, you do, Joe.
And when you, have something you published or want me to look at, I'll be happy to look at.
Can you tell, can you just, to end up, can you just tell people what you're working on now? You kind of talked about this edited volume you're working on. Do you have any other irons in the fire right now?
Yes, I do. I have a number of things that I'm working on. A lot of this is synthesis work.
You're good at it.
Trying to draw together. Trying to draw together. Well, the most important one is the book on African American healthcare and historical perspective. I did a short essay for a book called The Pandemic Divide, and it's a collection of essays that tries to make sense of the impact of the pandemic on Black communities. And that essay looks at African American work. From the colonial era. It builds on the Workers on Arrival book, but it delves deeply into the rural experiences of Blacks in the first part of the book, and talks about cotton, rice, tobacco, sugar, all those jobs, and connect those jobs to a deleterious health impact on Black workers. And then I take it to the the early emancipation period through to the present. And it is the consistent focus is on, we talk a lot about the pandemic has to be understood in historical perspective, but often people just invoke history. They don't really nail the historical study down and try to systematically trace out the impact of that historical process on the present. So that's what I try to do in that essay. But then I'm now trying to flesh that essay out into a short book that talks about Black health across time, but using the lens of occupational hazards as a real dimension that we need to pay attention to. So that's one item. The other one, I want to talk about all the things that may never come to fruition, but we are doing a book on it's a collection of essays on Black life in America. From the colonial period to the present. So there's about 10 specialized essays on different aspects of Black life over that period of time. And we try to use this book to say what next for Black urban history. And the University of Pittsburgh Press has given us a contract quite a long time ago, we should say. And so we've just had to keep adding to this book. So now we're at the point where we're saying by the 1st of 2023, we hope to be able to send it to the press and let them make some decisions about, publication.
Amazing, Joe. Thank you so much for your time today. Workers on Arrival is such a great book, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, well, thank you. It's been a joy. It's been a pleasure. And best wishes for all the work you are doing. And thanks for doing this work.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. Peoples and things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. Check out her work at julianacastro.co. Peoples and Things is a production of Virginia Tech Publishing and is supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. Production activities are hosted in the Athenaeum, a space in the library that acts as a hub for digital humanities teaching, learning, and creation. Joe Fort is the media production manager with Virginia Tech Publishing and serves as producer and sound engineer for Peoples and Things. Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. I also want to thank you for listening. Thanks.